When I started querying what will now be my debut romantasy novel, the feedback that I got from multiple agents was that my world building was not strong enough. The problem with this feedback was that I didn't really know how to implement it. World building in and of itself is a vast and complex craft thing to learn. And also, I wanted to know, when you've created the world yourself, how do you make it more vast and broad and detailed without bogging the reader down? As an author pursuing traditional publishing, I was already trying to balance things like writing craft and character development and prose, all together with extremely strict word count limits. There were plenty of writing craft books that I read over the years, but none of them were giving me the actual information I needed to go beneath the surface level of world building and discover what exactly would help make that part of my book stronger without bogging down the reader and the plot. During that time, I decided that the best course of action for myself was going to be to read a lot of fantasy novels and study what they were doing with their world building. This helped me more than anything else I did to try and improve my craft skill and ability. When you're a writer, learning how to read fiction and analyze what you're learning at a deeper than story level can really help improve your writing craft. It's a practice that I still employ today. I try to learn something from every fiction book that I read. And that is why today I'm going to talk about 8 science fiction and fantasy books that I believe will improve your world building ability. Let's get started. Okay, I have a mix of science fiction and fantasy books here. There are some young adult and some adult books, and each of them has taught me so much as I've tried to learn more about world building and apply it to my own writing. So let's briefly talk about each of these. Obviously, this list is not entirely exhaustive. If there are books that you think I missed, I would love to know what they are, so please make sure to leave them in the comments. I'm going to start by talking about the young adult fantasy, and then I'll move into the adult fantasy books, and then I'll move into the science fiction books. Up first, we have one of my favorite young adult fantasy books. This is a standalone, and it is Sophie and the Bone Song by Adrienne Tooley. This book hit my heartstrings in all the right ways. But more than that, it also had so much incredible world building that really taught me a lot. The most important thing that I learned about world building while I was reading this book is that it's important to make sure that your world building revolves around what your main character knows about your world. Let's get a little more specific though. In Sophie and the Bone Song, what that looks like is the main character, Sophie, is a teenager who desperately wants to follow in her father's footsteps and play music professionally. But music and magic are intertwined, and there are very strict rules to keep magic from running rampant. Because of this, only a few individuals are allowed to play and compose music. Sophie's father is one of those people, and she was raised with the intent to take his place. She spends this book going on a great journey and traveling all over the country. We know as readers that there are all of these politics at play and that magic has been very carefully restricted. But Sophie is a teenager, and she doesn't have infinite knowledge about the world that she lives in. She knows the very basic things about the politics of this world. And because of that, we as readers don't know everything about the politics either. The story is told from her point of view. So we learn enough about the world to feel like we're part of it and to understand the greater driving forces at play and to feel like we are in Sophie's shoes. As you're creating world building for your own novel, I think that this is something really important to try and keep in mind. Sometimes I fall into the trap of thinking, well, I know all of these characters' backstories, I know exactly how this political situation came to be in this country. Doesn't my reader deserve to know all of that too? And while the answer may be yes, it also might be no. You have to keep in mind that the things that should be driving your story are character related. As your characters make choices, the readers will naturally learn more about the world because they'll learn what's important to those characters. I highly recommend reading this book if you struggle with that, and even if you don't, I think it's a great read anyway. Up next, we have one of my favorite fantasy series of all time, and that is Furyborn by Claire Legrand. I don't typically buy a ton of special edition books, but when Illumicrate announced their special editions of this series, I had to have them because I love this series so much. Furyborn is the very definition of epic fantasy. In this trilogy, you have two main characters who live 1,000 years apart, but both of their stories are incredibly important to the plot and what is happening. A world changes a lot in 1,000 years, and I think that the author of this book did a really excellent job of making sure that readers could see exactly how the first timeline was built up so that we could understand just how drastic the change was in the second timeline. These books also play on the idea of angels as mythical creatures in a really fascinating way that I absolutely loved. I think too, it was a really interesting world building tool to take the past and the future and put them parallel to each other. As you read about the timeline that occurred in the past, you grow to love all of these characters. And then as you read the timeline set in the future, you start to learn that the decisions of the characters that you've grown to love have massively affected the world in a really negative way. This is one instance where I think the world building actually worked to enhance the character arc itself, and it helped me as a reader feel even more deeply about the decisions that all of these characters were making. With every world building element that fell into place, I understood the characters in the future better and the characters in the past. The world and the conflict at large helps you to really feel and empathize with each of them, even when they're making decisions that you really wish they wouldn't make. This series taught me as a writer to look at the book in front of me and determine what about the past influences the current events of my book. As my protagonist is going about their day, are there things that happened years ago that are influencing those decisions? If the political landscape looks different, if these characters are being motivated by events that have happened in the past, if they're trying to change things for the better, why are they trying to do that? You have to show what is at stake and what is really happening for these characters. I think that Furyborn is an absolutely great example of this, and if you have not read this series, you're absolutely sleeping on it and you need to get on it right now. The last young adult fantasy book I'm going to talk about is An Ember in the Ashes by Saba Tahir. An Ember in the Ashes is a YA fantasy classic. It's incredibly popular. I'd be very surprised if you hadn't heard of it, even if you hadn't read it. This book tackles a lot of really heavy topics and themes, all of which are related to war. I think the world building of this book works so well because despite being so complex, there are these really big issues at hand, and the main character, Laya, is experiencing a lot of them personally. As readers, we grow to root for her. So when she goes on a journey to help other people like her who are oppressed in the same way, we automatically root for her and root for them. Understanding Laya's station and seeing what happens to her as she is mistreated by this governing body allows readers to take those small actions, those small things that are happening to her, and understand that they're happening on a grand scale for large groups of people. I think the dual point of view with the other character, Elias, as well, is a really interesting world building tool that helps make this novel even better than it already was. We're told that the bad guys are bad and the good guys are good, but we're not just told it, we're shown it in everything that happens. And Elias, who's on the side of the bad guys, is slowly starting to discover that he doesn't want to be. Not only are we seeing the wrongs that are happening to Laya and people like her, we're seeing Elias' story too, and watching him grow as a person into someone who's not willing to stand for the wrong things anymore. Both of these stories, as they intertwine, they raise the stakes for the reader, and they make the world building become even more clear. The world and what's happening in the world is what motivates the characters to do what they do. And in that way, the character arc and the world building are intertwined. As you're writing your own book and working on your own world building, I'd urge you to ask yourself, what about this world makes my character want to change? By doing that, you'll find that the world building and the plot influence the character arc, which then influences the plot again, and it kind of goes back and forth like that. At least that's what I've found in my own writing. Up next is one of my absolute favorite reads of last year, and that is One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. This book is fantasy at its finest. If you haven't read it, you absolutely need to. The world building of this book feels very unique, and yet at the same time, it also feels very classic fantasy. I think part of the reason that the author was able to do this so well is because you have the present time, and in the present time, the characters have a problem. As they're working to solve this problem that will ultimately save the world and change it for the better, they are discovering piece by piece the mystery of what happened in the past to lead it to be like this. It can be a really useful tool to have readers learn and uncover secrets with the main character. It keeps readers from feeling left behind. And in this book, I think she does it particularly well. I consider magic systems to be part of world building too, especially when they're intertwined with what's happening in the world so intimately. This book, the magic system feels so unique, and I think part of what what makes it work so well is that it is very thoughtfully laid out and it has very straightforward rules. In this book, the magic system revolves around a set of cards that grant magic to the people who are holding the cards. So power isn't just a given, you have to take it, sometimes even steal it. Then there are exceptions to the rule, like our main character, and people are trying to figure out why that's happening. It can be really useful for your world building to have a mystery like that, because in order to understand the depth of the mystery, you have to make it very clear what is already there and established in order to explain why it's a mystery in the first place. This book really is just a masterpiece from start to finish, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I also think that as you're working on your own writing, you should ask yourself, what do my characters know? What do they not know? What's a given in my world? And what is different from the norm? And then why is that different from the norm? If you can take your reader on a journey with your main character, then your readers are automatically immersed in your story. The next book on my list is Godkiller by Hannah Kaner. This is also an epic fantasy in every sense of the word. The world presented to the reader is huge, it's vast, and it's incredibly complex. The plot of this book weaves together both individual stakes of people who want different things. It then weaves together things like political turmoil, and then you also have another level of gods and powerful magical beings with their own agendas. And yet, while the text in this book is a little bit small, it's still fairly short. I think for me, part of what managed to make this book so incredible is the way that the author so seamlessly ran all three of these narratives together into one. In this book, the three individual characters who are point of view characters each have different agendas. However, each of those agendas and each of those motivations that they have is sparked by the political and religious atmosphere of the world. I think that by putting these four unlikely characters together on a road trip style adventure, the author did a really great job of using that to help show the political differences and religious differences and belief between them, which in turn helped me as a reader to understand the broader political scope and religious scope of these issues. The political and religious threads of the world building are really tightly wound together. One of the characters, who's a main character, makes their living as a god killer. The other is the former best friend of the man who is now king. They both know things about the political structure of the world that the other doesn't know. They both have their pasts and their own qualms and traumas to deal with. And so by putting those two unlikely characters together and allowing them to teach each other slowly over the course of the novel, we as readers are also allowed to learn in time what the bigger stakes are for the world. This is another instance where I think it's really fascinating to see how world building and character arc can be so intertwined. Character arc can push world building and world building can push character arc. In fact, they probably should. In my own writing, this really inspired me to think bigger. I took the world that I had already built and I added another level to it. There were politics involved. I wondered, how does religion play into the politics? By accepting that every aspect of the world building was all intertwined, it became easier to take that world and more fully establish it in my own mind. And when it was fully established there, I was then able to convey it more directly and more clearly to the reader. I knew exactly what information readers needed in order to understand the bigger implications of all of these things. I definitely think you should pick this one up if you haven't already. It's a really, really great exercise in world building. You may have heard people in the past talk about using setting as a character in novels. Using setting as a character is a really great way to enhance your world building. I've seen it done in multiple ways. One is by making the actual world itself a sentient being. That one's not very frequently done. Another way is to make the setting of the story intricately tied into the plot. Perhaps the setting holds answers to a mystery, or it even has some sort of unique magic that motivates the characters and moves the plot forward. This book that I'm going to tell you about is one that uses setting as a character. And while the world building was already incredible, I think that element managed to elevate it even more. The book I'm talking about is For the Wolf by Hannah Witten. This is the first in a completed fantasy duology, and it's a retelling of the Little Red Riding Hood story. It's a really fascinating twist on the fairy tale, and I loved it. One element that really stood out to me was that the forest that the character goes to and is trapped inside of is sentient. As she learns more about what she's doing in the forest and why she's trapped there, the forest begins to speak to her and tell its own story. Because the setting was such a big part of the book and was a character in and of itself, I found myself as a reader really wanting to dig deeper into what made the forest tick. As I was reading, as the forest became a character to me, I wanted to know the same things about it that I wanted to know about the main character. Just like the other characters in the book, the forest had wants and goals and motivations. It was such a big part of the plot that there was also an element of the setting that was an antagonist to the forest itself. I think this element can really come into play if you're writing a book where the characters are attempting to change the world for the better. If your readers don't know enough about the setting or understand what is to be gained by making a better change, then the stakes aren't nearly as high. And while including a sentient forest in your book isn't always going to be possible, there are other things you can do to help make your world building feel that deep. You want the reader to be able to envision the better world that your characters are working toward. The more that your readers can feel immersed in the world that you've built and feel like the world itself is part of the character of the book, the more they'll root for the main characters who are trying to make efforts to change the world as well. The last two books that I'm going to talk about are science fiction novels. I read more fantasy than sci-fi, but sci-fi is still one of my favorite genres of all time. And I think it has a lot to offer to the world building conversation. The first sci-fi book I'm going to talk about is one that I actually just finished a couple weeks ago. It came out in 2024, and that is The Stars Too Fondly by Emily Hamilton. This book takes place in the somewhat near future. I want to say the year is in the 2060s when this book happens. It implements a few different things that I thought really made the world building stand out without making it too complicated. Sci-fi can get really deep really fast, and I tend to find myself more drawn to character-driven science fiction. If the world building gets too heavy, then I'm lost. That's a problem that I think a lot of writers have. If you know everything about a world, it's hard not to just put it all on the paper for your readers to see. This book is incredibly fascinating because the characters are living in the present time, the 2060s. As you read, you learn about events from the past, give the 2040s or so, that had a really big influence on what the characters are doing now in the present. The main character, Cleo, grew up idolizing the astronauts from the Providence space mission. That mission happened in 2040 in this book. However, now in 2060, we start the book discovering that the Providence mission failed and all of the people who were set to go on it disappeared mysteriously. By seeing little snippets of the past and learning how big of an impact this space mission had on these characters' childhoods, it makes it that much easier to understand why the book begins with them trying to discover what happened to the Providence. There are tons of elements of mystery, and one of those elements is what happened to the crew. As they explore the Providence and try to discover the answers to this, they're met with a hologram that is essentially a carbon copy of the ship's captain. The hologram reveals what she knows from her memories, and working together with the main characters, they're able to figure out some of what happened. As you read, you get little snippets of other things. Things like past conversations between crew members. Little tiny things that hint as to what the answer was. The readers are given these answers and they are paced so well and so perfectly that by the time you discover the answer, it doesn't feel far-fetched. It feels like it aligns with the rest of the world building because of the information that you now know, that you've gathered by yourself and with the crew. I am no scientist, but I do feel like the science and the world building and fantastical elements of this book were merged so well together that it felt very seamless to me. It made me love the characters even more to see their childhood selves and understand why the space mission mattered so much to them in the first place. It really did make the novel unputdownable for me. I think in your own writing, as you're planning out world building and deciding what elements of the world need to be on page and what needs to stay off, if you think of it like a mystery, you'll find yourself having a lot more success. I often ask myself, between the beginning and the end of the story, what's happening to my characters and what about the world do they have to know in order to go from point A to point B? What little things are my characters doing that will immerse my reader in the world without having to be explicitly stated? For example, one of the very first pages of the book is one of these past communication conversations between scientists on this crew. From the very beginning, I understand as a reader that this is a science fiction book and we are at a time in the future where this kind of communication happens seamlessly. It's different than texting, it's faster, it's more personal, and from the very beginning, I know that that's the standard and I've accepted it. Then by the time I have walked myself through the mystery of what happened to this crew, I have gathered enough hints as a reader to know that the answer makes sense. I was never really into novellas because I had a hard time thinking as an author and understanding how people could make Such short stories that still managed to encapsulate everything that I wanted to know as a reader. But when I was encouraged to give these a try, I found my mind very changed. This is the Murderbot Diaries series by Martha Wells. As you can see, these novellas are teeny tiny. They are very short. This hardback is 171 pages. I read most of the books in this series in a single day, and yet they still did not fail to immerse me entirely in this world. This is a series that literally just throws you headfirst into the world. We have a main character who is not human, who is part of a cloning and robotics program and has a job that it doesn't want. What I love about these books is that the character motivations are so much more important than a lot of the world building. The world building is there and it's complex and it's well thought out, but at no point does it get in the way of me understanding that Murderbot, the main character, is the person that I'm there for. I'm not there for the cool world stuff and the cool politics and the cool technology. I'm there and I'm still reading because I want to know what Murderbot is going to do next. The real star of the series is truly how character driven it is. The personality really shines through, and I think that makes this such a star of a book. Ultimately, what this novella has taught me is to, make sure that your world building is strong. Make sure that you're telling your readers everything they need to know in order to be able to understand the plot. When it's necessary, explain things to your audience, but never ever fall into the trap of making your world more interesting than your main character. Your main character is what should shine from your novel. And as you're looking to improve your world building or add more, it's important to make sure that you never overdo it so that your main character doesn't become overshadowed. These are some of my favorite books of all time. I'm definitely planning to do a reread of this series in this upcoming year, and I hope that you'll read them too. Even if you're not a science fiction fan, I truly think that they are so well put together that they have something to teach every writer out there. Okay guys, here's the final stack. I hope that this video was helpful, and if you like book recommendation videos like these where I recommend books specifically for what writers can learn from them, please let me know in the comments because I would love to talk more about books that I love that have helped me improve my writing too. Let me know if you had any other thoughts about these books too, and I'll see you next time.